Okay, in this last section, we're going to talk about the difference between the term sustainable development and the idea of a sustainable economy. So this word sustainable development, this term, it is around everywhere. You will have heard it uh, all over the place, especially in business. It's even in the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, formulated by the United Nations. It has a lot of legitimacy. It has a lot of support, and particularly from the business sector and the financial sector. So I just want to point out a few things. Sustainable development, the idea of this originated in economics, not in sustainability, in economics in the 17th century, and it was about sustainable forestry. They found they were cutting down the trees, and they were going to, their industry was going to die because there wasn't enough trees left. So they had this idea of sustainable forestry. They didn't cut down all the trees. That's point number one. Okay, point number two. Sustainable development assumes sustained economic growth. So there is this underneath assumption that we are going to continue to grow our economies, and that we need to continue to grow our economies. And that is an assumption. It is not a fact handed down, a fact of nature, or anything like that. And it is a contested idea. We do not need to continue to grow our economy unless we want to continue to make profit. Third point, sustainability as a thing, like we talk about, sustainability means looking after the environment, looking after people, making sure everyone's got enough money and food and etc. Sustainability, that is a thing, it's a noun. But sustainable development, the noun in that term is development. It just has that adjective sustainable, which makes the development part seem more legitimate. And if we talk about legitimization, as Berger and Luckman talked about it in legitimizing our choices, rationalizing and justifying, that word sustainable acts more like, more for legitimacy than actually to describe what it is, the thing that is being done. And we'll talk more about greenwashing and bluewashing in a later class. Okay, but sustainability and sustainable development are not the same. They're not nearly the same. You're really looking at sustainability and development. And so I'm sure someone else has thought of it before, but I want us to compare the idea of sustainable development to the idea of a sustainable economy. So what might a sustainable economy look like? Is it one where we continue to grow or not? Is it one that distributes wealth more fairly or more evenly? I don't know. Let's discuss. So, in Prosperity Without Growth, which is a book that Tim Jackson wrote, he said, questioning growth is deemed to be the act of lunatics, idealists, and revolutionaries, but question it we must. So that's my message to you this week. So you've probably heard this Brundtland Report definition of sustainable development. And a lot of people they say, what's sustainability? And they come out with this definition. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of generations in the future to meet their own needs, right? So, but people put them together and they forget that they're two different things. So this is a definition of sustainable development. It is not a definition of sustainability. Here's my article on sustainable forestry. This sustainable development idea originated back there, a small city in northern Germany. But what they found was, even though they managed to sustain their industry, a continuous supply of wood, they still strove for maximization of economic results, and it transformed and damaged the forests. So sustainable development doesn't necessarily mean sustaining the environment. Here's an example of what could be in a sustainable economy. So fishing is an industry where huge multinational fishing companies trawl for fish and profit, and they use huge nets, and all sorts of people, creatures that they're not even trying to catch will die, etc., etc. And fishing can lead to extinction of fish species or complete overfishing. But if instead of allowing that kind of fishing, if governments supported small-scale fishing, this would mean that we would be able to control the overfishing, we wouldn't have all that waste, and it would also support directly a lot more people in the industry. Just as an example. So here's Ruggiero put in an academic paper pointing out the difference between sustainability and sustainable development, and reminding us not to use these terms as synonyms. They're actually contradictory, because people point out that sustainable development is a contradictory concept due to the impossibility of sustaining infinite economic growth on a limited planet. Now, Wright and Nyberg, who are two of my favorite critical scholars, they did research into sustainability as a process of compromise, so corporate corruption of the environment. So they basically went out and they asked a whole pile of environmental officers in companies what happens when you have to choose between. And what they found was that every time that there was a compromise, the bottom line always won. And it was a necessary feature of their daily lives, the compromise between competing social goods of the market and the environment. And what they claim is that rather than protecting the environment, the corporate promotion of sustainability facilitates the corruption of the social good of the environment and its conversion into a market commodity. So it's actually used as a legitimizing tool and promotes and allows the environment to be destroyed. Wright and Nyberg are difficult read, but always worth it. I saw this article late last year where it said that economic growth is no longer linked to carbon emissions in most of the world. Annual carbon emissions worldwide from 1940 to 1925 is shown on the graph. It's increased every year, and it's always been assumed that for economic growth you needed to have carbon emissions, because almost all economic growth requires energy, and that required the burning of fossil fuels. But because we have made that not necessarily true anymore, we can de-link these, and we can still have, forever economic growth. But that's only one of the planetary boundaries that is being affected, and I think it's a bit of a it's a bit naive or a little bit obscure to say that just by decoupling these things we can have as much economic growth as we like. But of course it is also a good thing, because economic growth at this moment seems inevitable, so it's good that we can decouple it. However, yes, I did put the May 12 is when I clipped this article. The parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere was 432, whereas safe level is actually 350. And that was at the Paris Agreement. So when I was born, it was only 320. Okay, then in class, we looked at a study of the Pink Lake in Esperance. Esperance has a pink lake. It is of great social and cultural significance to the people of Esperance. It's also a tourist attraction, and it was also used to harvest salt from, because the pink color, comes from the algae that lives in high salt concentration water. So it's part of Esperance identity, and it's part of their economy, and it's part of their culture and their social, and of course there's a natural environment that is unique. Unfortunately, the Pink Lake is no longer pink, because they miscalculated how much salt they could take out of the lake and for it still to remain pink. So they took too much salt out to make money. However, there is still a Esperance Pink Lake Tourist Park, and I have stayed there. And they emphasize, yeah, we know the lake's not pink anymore, but there's lots of other fun things to do in Esperance. It is a source of local pride. It's interesting to note that the Tourism Western Australia photograph last year was still of a pink lake, whereas if you look at the photo up the top left, that's what it actually looks like. Of course, it's a bad news for the tour operators. This is actually Lake Hillier, which is another lake. It was pink longer than Pink Lake, but there was a big storm, and yeah, the bubblegum color disappeared. A massive offshore rainfall event in 2022. So, as an activity, what we did was discuss the economic, environmental, and social aspects of this situation. Does it matter that the Pink Lake isn't pink anymore? Why or why not? And what would we recommend if we were the local council in Esperance? What would we do? If we were the West Australian government, what would we do? From a sustainability point of view, what would be the best thing to do? Now, everybody discussed this in class. Honestly, the best suggestion I have ever had, because overwhelmingly people said, oh, yes, we've got to get the pink color back. Nobody really thinks why, but yes, we've got to get the pink back. But I don't know how to do that without dumping a lot of salt in, which of course would negate all the all the profits made by that company, would have to be put back in by the society. But the best suggestion I ever had was from one student who said, why don't you put a desalination plant right next to the lake and pump the brine into the lake? So that would be a good suggestion, I thought. Then we just stood up and said, how does it feel when you're trying to make a decision where the situation is ambiguous, it's boundless, and it's complex, and you don't know all the information, you don't know the cause and effect, there's a lot of stakeholders involved, it involves environment, social and economic factors, and there's boundless. It goes on into the future. We're probably not going to see the outcomes very quickly. How do we feel when we're trying to make decisions in that space? And as leaders, can we sit in that space and allow ourselves to consider what could and couldn't happen? Because it's a highly common thing for people to want to reduce uncertainty in their lives. And it's hard to sit with ambiguity. But great leaders can do it. Sit with it as long as possible. Sort of to wind up, the idea of different ways of thinking about economics. So rather than let's not have neoliberal economics, what perpetuates it is not just the way the system is, but also how we teach economics in business schools. And this is Rethinking Economics is a student-led organization that has gone on to challenge the way that economics is taught at universities around the world. Because this was a really big way in which neoliberalism was embedded, because Milton Friedman taught at the Chicago School of Economics, and graduates from the Chicago School of Economics went to work in many countries around the world as advisors, and they also went to work in the International Monetary Fund. And it had a huge impact by embedding it. And what these young people are saying now is that, hey, if we can do it that way, we can do it the other way. So let's teach critical economics, not just teach economics as if it's the only way. Let's say, well, this is one way, but we could do it a different way. So the communications lead from Rethinking Economics says that its aim is to make economics education plural, critical, decolonized, and historically grounded. So not just, what happens to prices when supply and demand changes, and not dominated by one way of looking at it, which is presented as neutral, objective, real, factual, natural. It's not. It's a construction. So they want economics education that takes account of the real world, the way economy is embedded in ecology, in power, in institutions, in history. And last idea for this section is donor economics. So Kate Raworth came up with this theory in 15 years ago. You will recognize on the outer ring the planetary boundaries. So what she's saying is this is the safe and just space for humanity to run economics. So there's the environmental ceiling, which we've already discussed, but also the social foundation that everybody should have access to food, water, education, income, voice, jobs, energy, social equity, and equality, and health. So not just the planetary boundaries, not just an ecological limit, but a social basis. What is it that everybody should be able to expect to have dignity in the world? If you go to this article, what you'll see, you can click on the 2000 or the 2025 and see how the limits have changed over that time, and it's quite significant. We already know that the outer limits have been breached, and then it's too hard to see in that picture, but if you go to the article, you'll be able to see the way that the different inner limits are not being met by our economy as it stands today. Back to Tim Jackson and prosperity without growth, and his idea that growth has delivered its benefits at best unequally. And beyond a certain point, this continued pursuit of economic growth doesn't appear to advance and may even impede human happiness. Any credible version of prosperity has to address the question of limits, and we cannot just go on business as usual. We stand in urgent need of a renewed sense of shared prosperity, a deeper commitment to justice in a finite world. And you don't have to read the whole book. There's a Guardian article about it just there. And his quote that I really like, that prosperity for the few, founded on ecological destruction and persistent social injustice, is no foundation for a civilized society.